The first time Daniel told us he could see dead people, he was 7 years old, sitting at our kitchen table with chocolate milk still dripping down his chin. Mom was washing dishes, and I was doing homework when he casually mentioned that the old woman in the corner was asking about her cat. "What old woman?" Mom had asked, turning around with soap suds still clinging to her yellow rubber gloves. Daniel pointed to the empty space near our refrigerator. "She's right there. She says her name is Mrs. Patterson, and she's looking for Whiskers." Mom and I exchanged that look, the one that said our little brother had quite an imagination. We lived in a new subdivision in suburban Connecticut, and as far as we knew, no Mrs. Patterson had ever lived in our house. Mom gently explained that sometimes children make up stories, and that was perfectly normal. But Daniel insisted. He described the woman in detail. Gray hair in a neat bun, a blue, floral dress, and worried eyes that kept darting toward the back door. He said she visited every Tuesday and Thursday, always asking about the same orange tabby cat. As months passed, Daniel's visitors became a regular part of our family dynamic. There was the man in the basement who hummed old jazz tunes, the little girl in the attic who played with invisible toys, and the teenage boy who sat on our front porch steps every evening at sunset. Daniel would tell us their stories with the matter-of-fact tone that other kids use to describe their friends from school. Our parents handled it with patience and humor. Dad would sometimes play along, asking Daniel to tell the basement man to keep his humming down during dinner. Mom would remind Daniel not to disturb the little girl's playtime when he went to fetch Christmas decorations. They treated it as an elaborate game, a phase that would eventually pass. I was less patient. Being 3 years older, I found Daniel's ghost stories embarrassing, especially when he'd mention them in front of my friends. During sleepovers, he'd wander into my room and announce that the lady in blue was downstairs making phantom tea again. My friends thought it was hilarious, but I wished my little brother would just act normal for once. The breaking point came during my 13th birthday party. I'd invited 8 classmates over, and we were in the backyard playing Capture the Flag when Daniel appeared at the patio door, his face pale and serious. "Sarah," he called out, using my full name instead of his usual Sarah. "The man says you need to move away from the old oak tree. He says it's not safe." My friends stopped playing and stared. The oak tree in question was massive, probably 60 years old, and stood at the far end of our property. We'd been running around it all afternoon. "Daniel, go inside," I hissed, mortified. "We're fine." But he wouldn't budge. "He's really worried, Sarah. He says the roots are loose, and the wind is picking up." It was true about the wind. What had been a calm afternoon was turning breezy. But the tree looked as solid as ever, its thick trunk showing no signs of instability. "There's no man, Daniel," I snapped. "Stop making things up." His eyes filled with tears, but he stood his ground. "I'm not making it up. I can see him. He's standing right next to the tree, and he's scared." My friends were giggling now, and I felt my face burn with embarrassment. I marched over to Daniel, grabbed his arm, and started pulling him toward the house. That's when we heard the crack. The sound was like a gunshot, followed by a groaning that seemed to come from deep within the earth. We all turned to see the massive oak tree tilting, its root system pulling free from the rain-softened ground. In what felt like slow motion, the ancient tree crashed down exactly where we'd been playing just minutes before. The silence that followed was deafening. My friends stood frozen, their mouths hanging open. I stared at the fallen giant, its branches covering the entire area where we'd been running around moments earlier. Daniel wiped his nose with his sleeve and looked up at me. "He says, 'You're welcome,'" he whispered. That night, after my friends had gone home and the excitement had died down, I found Daniel in his room, drawing pictures of people I couldn't see. I sat on his bed and watched him work, adding careful details to faces that existed only in his world. "Daniel," I said quietly. "Who was the man by the tree?" He didn't look up from his drawing. "His name was Mr. Carlyle." He used to live here before our house was built. He said he planted that tree when his son was born, but it got sick last winter. Daniel added, shading to the man's jacket. He didn't want anyone to get hurt like his son did. I wanted to ask more questions, but something in my brother's tone made me hesitate. There was a sadness there, a weight that seemed too heavy for a 7-year-old to carry. Instead, I just sat with him until Mom called us for dinner, watching him bring invisible people to life with his crayons and wondering if maybe, just maybe, we'd been wrong about everything. The weeks following the tree incident changed everything in our household. Mom started paying closer attention when Daniel mentioned his visitors, asking follow-up questions instead of simply nodding along. Dad stopped making jokes about the humming man in the basement and actually seemed to listen when Daniel described what the spirits were doing. But it was me who became truly obsessed. I started keeping a notebook, writing down everything Daniel said about his ghosts. The woman in blue, Mrs. Patterson, appeared every Tuesday and Thursday between 3 and 4 in the afternoon. The basement man hummed specifically on rainy days. Always the same melody that Daniel could hum back perfectly. The little girl in the attic only showed up when Mom was doing laundry, as if the sound of the washing machine called to her. 3 months after my birthday party, I decided to do some research. I rode my bike to the local library and spent an entire Saturday afternoon digging through old records and newspaper archives. What I found made my hands shake as I turned the yellowed pages. Margaret Patterson had indeed lived on our street, not in our house, but 3 doors down in the small colonial that now belonged to the Hendersons. She died 12 years ago at the age of 74. The obituary mentioned that she was preceded in death by her beloved cat, Whiskers, and that she'd spent her final years worrying about pets in the neighborhood. But that wasn't the most unsettling discovery. I found a property record from 1962 showing that our land had once been part of a larger estate owned by the Carlyle family. Robert Carlyle had built a small farmhouse where our subdivision now stood. According to a brief news article from 1978, the farmhouse had burned down in an electrical fire. Robert Carlyle had died in the blaze while trying to save his 15-year-old son, Michael, who had been trapped upstairs. Michael had survived, but Robert hadn't made it out. The article mentioned that Robert had been particularly proud of the oak tree he'd planted in 1963 to celebrate Michael's birth, the same tree that had fallen in our backyard. I pedaled home faster than I'd ever ridden my bike, my notebook clutched against my chest. I found Daniel in the living room, watching cartoons while building an elaborate fort out of couch cushions. "Daniel," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can you tell me more about Mr. Carlyle?" He looked up from his construction project. "Which one? The dad? Or the son?" My heart stopped. "There are 2 of them?" "Well, yeah. The dad mostly stays by where the tree was, but sometimes he comes inside. Son usually hangs out upstairs in what used to be his room." Daniel pointed toward the ceiling. "That's probably why Mom's sewing room always feels cold. Michael says he gets lonely." I sank onto the couch beside him. "Daniel, how long have you been seeing them?" "Since we moved here. But they don't really talk much to each other. I think they're sad about something that happened a long time ago." He picked up another cushion and placed it carefully on his fort. "Michael keeps apologizing to his dad, and his dad keeps saying it wasn't his fault. It's kind of sad, actually." That evening, I showed my parents what I'd found at the library. We sat around the kitchen table as I read the articles aloud, watching their expressions change from skepticism to confusion to something that looked like fear. "This could all be coincidence," Mom said finally, but her voice lacked conviction. "Daniel could have overheard neighbors talking or about people who died before he was born," I interrupted. "Mom, he knew about the tree. He knew about Mrs. Patterson's cat. How could he possibly know these things?" Dad was quiet for a long time, staring at the photocopied articles spread across our table. "Maybe we should talk to someone," he said eventually. a professional, someone who might understand this better. But before we could make any appointments or phone calls, everything escalated. It started with the photographs. Daniel had always been artistic, but lately, his drawings had become incredibly detailed. He would spend hours sketching faces, adding tiny lines around eyes and careful shading to capture expressions. When I looked at his recent work, I realized he was drawing the same people over and over. The same woman in blue, the same man in old-fashioned clothes, the same teenage boy with sad eyes. Then Mom found the camera. She'd been cleaning Daniel's room when she discovered her old Polaroid camera hidden under his bed, along with a stack of photographs. When she called us upstairs, her voice was shaking. The photos were of our house, different rooms, different angles, but in several of them, there were shadows and shapes that didn't belong. Translucent figures standing in doorways, sitting in chairs, looking out windows. The images were blurry and unclear, but unmistakably human in form. "Daniel," Dad said quietly, "did you take these pictures?" Daniel nodded, looking worried that he was in trouble. "I wanted to show you that I wasn't making it up. Sometimes they show up in pictures, but not always. The lady in blue really likes having her picture taken, but the man in the basement gets upset when I try." I picked up one of the photos with trembling hands. It showed our living room, and there, sitting in Dad's favorite recliner, was the unmistakable outline of a person. The figure was see-through, like a double exposure, but the facial features were clear enough to make out. It was an elderly woman with gray hair in a neat bun, wearing what looked like a blue floral dress. Mom sat down heavily on Daniel's bed. "We need to call someone," she whispered. "I don't know who, but we need help." That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak and groan of our house. For the first time since we'd moved in, I found myself wondering who else might be sharing our home, and whether Daniel's ability to see them was a gift or a curse. Around midnight, I heard footsteps in the hallway, soft, measured steps that paused outside my door. I held my breath, waiting for them to continue toward the bathroom or back to Daniel's room. Instead, there was a gentle knock on my door. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. The knock came again. 3 soft taps that were definitely intentional. "Sarah?" It was Daniel's voice, barely above a whisper. I exhaled in relief and opened the door to find my little brother standing in the hallway, his face pale in the dim light from the nightlight. "I can't sleep," he said. "They're all talking at once tonight. It's really loud." For the first time, I didn't dismiss his words. Instead, I knelt down to his eye level. "What are they saying?" "They know you found out about them. Mrs. Patterson is excited because someone finally believes me. But Mr. Carlyle and Michael are worried." Daniel rubbed his eyes with his fists. "They think you might try to make them leave." I looked past him into the darkened hallway, seeing nothing but shadows. "Do you want them to leave?" Daniel considered this seriously. "Not really. Most of them are nice. They're just sad or confused. Mrs. Patterson helps me with my math homework sometimes, and Michael tells me stories about what it was like when he was alive." He paused, "But I wish they weren't so sad all the time." The next morning, our parents made a decision that surprised all of us. Instead of calling a priest or a paranormal investigator, Dad contacted the local historical society. He explained our situation carefully, focusing on the historical accuracy of Daniel's descriptions rather than the supernatural aspect. Margaret Foster, a retired librarian who volunteered with the society, came to our house that Tuesday afternoon. She was a small woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a practical manner that immediately put us at ease. "I've been researching local families for 30 years, she told us, as we sat in our living room. "The Carlyle story has always bothered me because the records were incomplete. If your son really has been in contact with them, there might be things they want us to know. Daniel was initially shy around Mrs. Foster, but she spoke to him like an adult, asking specific questions about the people he saw. Within an hour, she had filled several pages with notes. The fire wasn't an accident, Daniel told her, his voice matter of fact. Michael says someone was supposed to fix the old wiring, but they never came. His dad kept calling, but the electrician was always too busy. Mrs. Foster's pen stopped moving. The official report said it was faulty wiring, but there was never any investigation into why the repairs hadn't been made. She looked up at my parents. If this is true, it means Robert Carlyle died because of someone else's negligence. Over the following weeks, Mrs. Foster worked with Daniel to piece together the full story. The Carlyle family had been trying to get their electrical system updated for months before the fire. They'd contacted several contractors, but in the 1970s, rural electrical work wasn't considered urgent unless it was an emergency. Michael had been sick with pneumonia the night of the fire, which was why he'd been upstairs instead of helping his father in the barn as usual. Robert had tried to carry his son out, but the staircase had collapsed before he could make it back down. Michael blames himself for being sick, Daniel explained to us one evening. And his dad blames himself for not getting the wiring fixed sooner. They've been stuck feeling guilty for all these years. Mrs. Foster suggested something that initially seemed strange, but somehow felt right. She proposed that we hold a small memorial service in our backyard, acknowledging both Robert and Michael Carlyle, and formally recognizing what had happened to them. Sometimes spirits linger because their stories haven't been properly told, she explained. If we can give them recognition and peace, they might be able to move on. The memorial was simple. We planted a small oak sapling near where the old tree had fallen, and Mrs. Foster read a brief history of the Carlyle family. Daniel stood quietly throughout the ceremony, occasionally nodding as if listening to someone we couldn't hear. "They say thank you," he whispered, when Mrs. Foster finished speaking. "Michael says his dad finally understands it wasn't his fault, and his dad says Michael was just a kid who got sick. They're not angry anymore." That night, our house felt different. The persistent chill in Mom's sewing room disappeared. The basement stopped echoing with phantom jazz melodies. Even Mrs. Patterson seemed to visit less frequently, though Daniel said she still stopped by occasionally to check on the neighborhood cats. But Daniel's ability didn't go away. Over the next year, we learned to live with our unusual situation. Daniel continued to see spirits, but now he understood his role differently. Instead of simply observing them, he became a bridge between the living and the dead, helping resolve unfinished business and bringing peace to restless souls. Mrs. Foster became a regular visitor, documenting the historical information that Daniel's contacts provided. Together, they solved several local mysteries and helped other families understand their own supernatural experiences. Our parents adapted with surprising grace. Mom started leaving small offerings, a cup of tea, fresh flowers, for the spirits Daniel described. Dad learned to listen without judgment when Daniel shared messages from people who had passed on. As for me, I never developed Daniel's gift, but I learned something equally valuable. I discovered that the world is far more complex and mysterious than I had ever imagined, and that dismissing something simply because we don't understand it can cause us to miss profound truths. Daniel is 15 now, and his ability has evolved with age. He's more selective about which spirits he helps, focusing on those who are truly trapped by unresolved issues. He's also learned to set boundaries, creating quiet times when he can't be reached by the supernatural world. Last month, a new family moved into Mrs. Patterson's old house. Their 8-year-old daughter has been telling her parents about an elderly woman who visits her room and helps her find lost toys. The family thinks it's an overactive imagination. Daniel just smiles when I tell him these stories. "She'll figure it out eventually," he says. "Some kids just see more than others." I've come to realize that my brother doesn't see ghosts, despite being normal. He sees them because he's extraordinary. In a world that often dismisses what it can't explain, Daniel remains open to possibilities that most of us have forgotten how to perceive. We were wrong to doubt him, but more than that, we were wrong to assume that being wrong was something to fear. Sometimes being wrong opens doors to understanding we never knew existed. And sometimes, those doors lead to the most important truths of all.
Thank you for watching until the end. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. There's a lot more interesting content coming soon.